Now I'll talk about the other special forms. These are going to be covered in lab and discussion, and they'll show up in homeworks in the next project. So you'll get exposure to them eventually, but I'll give you a preview now, just so that you know what's coming. First we'll talk about cond and then begin. The cond special form, where cond is short for condition, is like having elif clauses, or a big if, elif, else statement in Python. So in Python, you can have one statement with multiple different clauses, and you can have as many elifs as you want, as long as you start with an if, and then there's this optional else at the end. And you could achieve this same result just using if in Scheme by having that last consequent expression have another if in it, and its consequent have another if in it. So you don't really need anything new, but if you have a lot of elifs, then this nested if idea is kind of annoying. Which is why there's cond. So here's a Scheme example that does the same thing. Cond has as the rest of its expression a bunch of pairs, where the pairs are the condition and then what to do if that condition is true. So this says if x is greater than 10, then print big. Otherwise, if x is greater than 5, print medium. Otherwise, print small. Much like in Python, the else case is optional, but there can be only one, and it has to be at the end. Both of these have the same property, that only one thing will be printed, no matter the value of x. So, if x is 12, it's both bigger than 10 and bigger than 5, but only big will be printed because x greater than 5 is the condition of an elif that comes after the x greater than 10 that gets triggered first. And the same is true over here. Now, a cond expression does have a value. So if instead of printing, I just said that I want an expression whose value is either big, medium, or small, depending on the value of x, then I would write it like this. And I could do something with that value. For example, I could print it. Now, these two expressions are equivalent. They'll either print big, medium, or small, but this one I think is shorter because it has only one print instead of 3. So that's cond. You can still use if, and usually what happens in practice is that if you're just choosing among two alternatives, then you use if, and if it's more than 2, then you use cond. The begin special form combines multiple expressions into one expression. The value of a begin special form is just the value of its last sub-expression. And the reason begin is used is so that you can do things, for example, printing for a while, or defining some symbols as particular values, before you compute the result that you want. So here's a Python case where within the suite for an if clause, I've printed twice, and likewise for the else clause. How do you do that in Scheme? Well, you need begin. You say, here are some conditions, the first of which is that if x is greater than 10, I want to both print big and print guy. But there's only space in Scheme for one expression here, and so the begin expression allows you to put as many things as you want as sub-expressions, and they'll all get evaluated. And by the way, since there are only two alternatives here, it would be a little bit more natural to just do it with an if. And you can indent however you want or go to new lines however you want. So here's an equivalent expression that just says if x is greater than 10, then print big and print guy. Otherwise, print small and print fry.